This video is part of Monopoly. In it, I will discuss the relationship among marginal revenue, price, and elasticity for a monopolist. To start, let's explore the mathematical relationship between a monopolist's marginal revenue and elasticity of demand. To do this, we're first going to return to an equation presented and described in the Monopoly profit maximization video. This was the equation for marginal revenue. A key in understanding this equation is remembering that when the law of demand holds, dP/dQ is negative. Therefore, one of the major takeaways from this equation is that marginal revenue for the monopolist is less than the price. That again is because in order to sell an additional unit, the monopolist has to cut its price, not just on that additional unit, but also on all the previously sold units. Therefore, the additional revenue that is generated from selling this additional unit is less than the price charged for the additional unit. Now what we're going to do is expand on this equation to see how marginal revenue and elasticity of demand are related. This really is one of my favorite things. I think it's so clever how someone determined that you can take this second term and multiply and divide it through by price. Multiplying and dividing through by price doesn't change this term, but as I'm going to show you, it does allow us to enter elasticity of demand into this equation. For this, remember that elasticity of demand is dQ dP times P over Q. With that in mind, notice how what we have here is the reciprocal of elasticity. We have dP/dQ times Q over P, which is 1 over the elasticity of demand. Therefore, we can write this equation for marginal revenue, the same equation that told us that marginal revenue is less than price, as price times 1 plus 1 over epsilon. With elasticity added to the equation, we can now better understand the relationship between marginal revenue and elasticity. One way to understand this relationship is to simply plug values for elasticity into the equation to see what that implies about marginal revenue. For example, consider where demand is perfectly elastic. If demand is perfectly elastic, just like in a perfectly competitive market, then epsilon is minus infinity. Marginal revenue equals price times 1 plus 1 over minus infinity. 1 plus 1 over minus infinity is 1 plus 0. And so we see, just like in perfect competition, marginal revenue equals price when demand is perfectly elastic. Now let's consider an example where demand is elastic. For example, if epsilon is minus 2. In this case, marginal revenue equals price times 1 plus 1 over minus 2, which will give us a marginal revenue equal to price divided by 2, which is positive. Mathematically, where demand is elastic, marginal revenue is positive. When demand is unit elastic, epsilon is minus 1, so marginal revenue is going to be 0. Lastly, when demand is inelastic, for example, if elasticity is minus 1/2, then marginal revenue will be negative. We can also see this relationship between marginal revenue and elasticity graphically. What we have here is a graph of a demand curve, the equation for which is price equals 24 minus Q, and the corresponding marginal revenue curve. Remember that whenever demand is linear, marginal revenue will have the same intercept and exactly double the slope as the inverse demand. Thus, because P is 24 minus Q, marginal revenue is 24 minus 2Q. When we graph these equations, this is what we get. Both of these curves, demand and marginal revenue, have intercepts of 24. Thus, they both start at a price of 24. Both are linear and downward sloping. Demand has a slope of -1, whereas marginal revenue has a steeper slope of -2. We see that on the graph that demand is flat relative to marginal revenue, and marginal revenue is steeper relative to demand. Also note that when demand hits its midpoint, which is what it sounds like, the middle of demand, marginal revenue is exactly equal to 0. I like to think of these two curves as both starting at the same point and racing down to 0. Marginal revenue being twice as steep as demand means marginal revenue finishes the race twice as fast. When marginal revenue gets to 0, demand is only halfway to 0 and therefore at its midpoint. Now we can see from this graph what we saw on the previous slide from the equation, and that is when demand is elastic region of a linear demand is the upward half. When demand is elastic, marginal revenue is positive. On the other hand, when demand is inelastic, which is the bottom half of a linear demand, when demand is inelastic, marginal revenue is negative. And finally, when demand is unit elastic, which is always true at the midpoint of a linear demand, marginal revenue is exactly equal to 0. Why is this relationship important? Remember that a monopolist chooses to produce the quantity at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We usually think of marginal cost as positive. It certainly can't be negative. It can't cost less in total to produce a higher quantity. I like to think of that as the expression, you can't get something from nothing. It's only going to cost more or the same amount to produce more. When marginal cost is positive, what that means is the monopoly will end up producing where marginal revenue is also positive. And where marginal revenue is positive, we are operating in the elastic region of the demand curve. Monopolies will therefore choose to produce in the elastic region of demand when marginal cost is positive. Another way of saying this is to state that monopolists will never choose to produce in the inelastic region of their demand. Why is this? Well, suppose the monopolist currently is producing where epsilon in absolute value is less than 1, or where demand is inelastic. If the monopolist increased its price, by the law of demand, fewer consumers would buy the product, and so the monopolist would sell a smaller quantity. Because demand is inelastic, the percentage by which the quantity will fall will be smaller than the percentage by which the price rose. So total revenue, the product of price and quantity, will go up. Again, that's because the price is rising by more than the quantity is falling in percentage terms. At the same time, because the firm's producing a smaller quantity, it's incurring a smaller total cost. Put these two together, and that's good news in both cases. Revenue is up and costs are down, so profit will increase. Whenever the firm is producing where elasticity is inelastic, the firm will always have an incentive to increase price, lower quantity, because by doing that, it will increase its profit, and it will continue to do that until it just moves itself right out of the inelastic region of demand. Again, visually, if the firm started out in the inelastic region of its demand, it would have an incentive to increase price, lower quantity demanded, to increase profit, and it would continue to do this until it just moved itself right out of that inelastic region of demand. Another reason to care about elasticity in studying monopolies is that the more inelastic demand is, the higher the price will be. The more elastic demand is, the lower the price will be. That's demonstrated here by these figures. In market A, we see a relatively flat or elastic demand, and in market B, we see a relatively steep or inelastic demand. For simplicity, marginal cost is assumed to be constant in each market. Both firms are profit maximizers, and so each chooses its quantity by figuring out where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Each firm then looks to, at this quantity, demand to find the highest price that consumers would be willing to pay. And what we see from the comparison of the two graphs, the price is higher in market B than it is in market A because demand is more inelastic in market B than it is in A. In other words, because demand is less elastic in market B, the price in market B is greater than the price in market A. To make intuitive sense of this, remember that elasticity of demand depends on consumers' tastes and options. Demand becomes more elastic as, for example, better substitutes for the firm's product are introduced, or as more firms enter the market selling a similar product, or as firms that provide the same service locate closer to the firm. As demand becomes more elastic because alternatives or substitutes become more available, that lowers the monopolist's ability to charge as high of a price. In summary, the more elastic a monopolist's demand, the lower the price the monopolist can charge, and the more inelastic a monopolist's demand, the higher the price the monopolist can charge.